With the other slideshow, we looked at the how the war played out, and it's the United States' unwillingness to make a total commitment to this war. Today, we're going to look at how this played out at home. The number of protests escalated, and the leaders of this country, as well as its people, became divided over what to do. As we said, it's America's most controversial war, and I wrote here it's its longest war, but I probably haven't updated that since the War on Terror. We lost over 58,000 troops. This number you may have heard a lot about in the last few weeks because the number of people that have died from the coronavirus is now in about 73,000, I believe. And they kept saying that this was, significant because it's more than the Vietnam War in 2 months as compared to years and years and years, the 13 years of the Vietnam War. The war did not end until 1973, and as we saw in 1975, North Vietnam took over South Vietnam. The country was bitterly divided over whether or not we should even be there. So we looked at the Democratic Convention in Chicago as an example of the protests, and for many it became a symbol. It was the focal point of the decade. As it says there, on the streets and in the parks of Chicago, the social conflicts of the 60s were on display. Here's a quote: "Heads were cracked, tear gas billowed, police lines advanced through demonstrators, and television cameras captured some of the graphic scenes. The eyes of the nation focused on Chicago, and we decided who we were, what side we were on, and what we would fight for. Chicago changed minds, Chicago changed politics, Chicago changed the left, Chicago changed the media. Chicago changed those who were there and those who watched from far away." Again, imagine seeing this on your TV every single night. College students, young people, peacefully protesting, often being attacked by police or National Guard. Some demonstrators in this photo climbed on a statue to protest the war as well as the harsh treatment that they had received from the Chicago police. Here's a famous protest taking place in front of the U.S. Capitol building. Another one of tear gas being thrown back at the soldiers. And here's an interesting protest: drop acid, not bombs. Some of you are familiar with NYU in Lower New York City. Here's the Washington Square Park Arch, and it's an anti-war rally in 1969. I love how the photographer captured this image down here of the sort of everyday housewife being talked to by a young person with a pamphlet in her hand, and I assume he was trying to change her mind and get her to look at things his way. The famous chant was, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" So this is the beginning of hippie culture that was often woven in with anti-war protesters. But the 60s, as we'll see, the focus became not only the war, but civil rights, certainly for African Americans, and later on for women as well. Now, here are some people that don't look like hippies. They're actually college professors with their families. And notice their signs. They're striking for peace, striking against war, striking against racism and the draft. And as I said in the other PowerPoint, the draft was especially a flashpoint because it was seen as inequitable and heavily weighted towards those who are poor or those who are minorities. Here's a photo of the Columbia University Strike Committee. Columbia students occupied the president's office for several days until they were beaten up by security guards and finally forced to leave. Many students protested not only the war, but they wanted an ability to have more of a say in their education. Another rally. And here's one of the most famous protesters. Today we know her as an American actress of Grace and Frankie. Jane Fonda was an outspoken activist and actually traveled to Hanoi, the capital of North Vietnam during the war. So here she is posing with the enemy, climbing inside one of their, I don't know, looks like a tank or something with their weapons. Many people of a certain generation, including my dad, who died 2 years ago, hated this woman, thought she was a traitor to her country, and would not go near any of the movies that she was in. She has since apologized, and she said it's the biggest regret of her life. Here's a photo of her sitting at an anti-war rally. And what's more important, or more interesting, I guess, is the person who's right here. That is former U.S. Senator from Massachusetts, John Kerry, former Secretary of State, who had served in Vietnam and came back and became an outspoken anti-war activist. Here he is with his men on the type of boat he was on. It was called a Swift boat. And when he was running for president several years ago, several of his men came out in support, and several men came out and said that he had exaggerated his service and heroics in the military. But here he is, a very young Kerry, down here, who is testifying before Congress. How do you ask a man to be the last man to die in Vietnam? How do you ask a man to be the last man to die for a mistake? He famously took his medals that he had earned and flung them over the White House fence in defiance. And later on, when he questioned this, he said he actually kept the medals and only flung the ribbons over. Again, think of what World War II veterans thought when they saw these young people on TV supporting the enemy. Here's a young person holding a flag of North Vietnam. Here's a young person holding a picture of Mao Zedong and saying that America was the enemy. So the country was bitterly, bitterly divided. Folk music of the early 60s, here's Peter, Paul, and Mary. You may have heard of them, of that song Blowing in the Wind or Puff the Magic Dragon. Folk music gave way to heavier rock music in the 60s and early 70s that were protest songs, and that's one of the assignments that you'll have to do. My little anecdote here, this is Mary, I forget her last name, and when I worked in Macy's department store in the early 80s over Christmas, she came in and bought a bathrobe from me. Let's look at POWs. 771 Americans were captured and interned. Of those, 85% were returned to U.S. authorities at the end of a grueling conflict. Here is one of the most famous prisoner of war camps. It was in Hanoi, and it was nicknamed the Hanoi Hilton. While not as brutal as the Japanese, some of the tactics used were pretty horrific. Here is the highest ranking American, Commander Denton, and he was given the honor of speaking for all the POWs as they were released. Here's a photo of the men on the plane as they are leaving Vietnam. Some had been held as long as 9 years. Here is a man by the name of James Stockdale. He actually ran for vice president in 1992. And look at him. He is in his mid-40s in this picture. He looks about 80. And he sees his wife and 3 sons for the first time in 8 years. And here's some photos of his time in captivity. Most famous POW, of course, is the late Senator John McCain, who was a Navy pilot and was shot down. His father was a very high-ranking Navy man, and in some cases, and some reason for that, he suffered terribly because of who his father is. Take a look at the link there as he reflects on his experience. It's very moving, and it gives you insight into the torture that these men endured. I remember this photo because I was about the age of this girl when the POWs came home, and it won the Pulitzer Prize that year. Unfortunately, as is the case with many POWs, including John McCain, the families often split up and the couples divorced. It was just too hard to try to recreate your family when you'd been separated for so long. And in many cases, the men suffered terrible, terrible PTSD. So at home, as I mentioned earlier, burning a draft card became a symbol of protest. Here's an interesting poster. Girls say yes to boys who say no. This poster was put out urging people, young men, to resist the draft. And hippies, as we mentioned, were very much a part of this war protest. Hippies were an interesting phenomenon throughout the 60s and into the 70s. Young men and women, baby boomers, who had usually been raised in a life of affluence and rejected society's values. They had a phrase that said, never trust anybody over 30. And many of them were involved with drugs and traveled the country and often living communally. Music festivals, of course, the most famous one took place in 1969 was Woodstock. Woodstock always amazes me. Here's some hippies walking through Woodstock, New York on the way to the festival, because this festival was organized very quickly and word got out and they had literally hundreds of thousands of people attending. And I think about this all done before the internet, all done before texting, all done before social media. They ended up at a man's farm. Look how many people were at this concert. Unfortunately, it rained. They only had about 1/10 of the number of porta potties that they needed. And by all accounts, it was a muddy, glorious mess. Now, I mentioned before how this war was able to get Americans deeply involved, and that was through the medium of television. This man over here is Walter Cronkite, and he was the most trusted newsman in America. We didn't have the competing networks like we do today with CNN and Fox and things like that. So Americans trusted him to tell the truth. And then, of course, we found out that our own government was often lying to us. Here's another famous photograph of a suspected member of the Viet Cong being shot. And these pictures were on TV at night. This is another Pulitzer Prize winning photograph that is horrific. This young girl is naked because she tore off her burning clothes as she ran from her village. And of course, they had been bombed using napalm, which we talked about earlier. She now is my age and she lives in Canada, and she has terrible, terrible scars, but has managed to live a somewhat normal life. So a few pictures of Vietnam before we end. Such a divisive war. And a photograph, of course, from the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, which you've all seen. People leave things there in memory of their loved ones. Here's some army boots, looks like a cigarette lighter, lots of flags, lots of notes. Very, very moving to go there. Okay.